It was 9:14 a.m. on a Thursday morning in Washington, and Jim Jordan was already talking over someone. The House Judiciary Committee hearing on oversight accountability had been scheduled to begin at 9, but Jordan had arrived early, holding court with a cluster of reporters in the hallway outside the chamber. His voice carried that particular frequency of Ohio confidence, loud enough to command space, casual enough to suggest he'd done this 1,000 times before. When Jasmine Crockett entered the hearing room 7 minutes later, Jordan's eyes followed her with the kind of dismissive recognition reserved for people who believe they've already won an argument that hasn't started yet. She was carrying a single leather folder, unremarkable in thickness, navy blue with gold corners. Jordan glanced at it the way someone might glance at a child's homework. He leaned over to Congressman Biggs and said something that made Biggs smirk. Crockett took her seat, placed the folder precisely in front of her, and began reviewing the first page with the kind of stillness that suggested she had nowhere else to be and all the time required. The hearing opened with standard procedural language, but Jordan interrupted the opening statement within 45 seconds to clarify a jurisdictional technicality that did not require clarification. His voice had that practiced urgency, the tone of someone who believes interruption equals authority. When Crockett's turn came to question the witness, a former inspector general who had documented departmental spending irregularities, Jordan interrupted before she finished her first sentence. "Point of order, Mr. Chairman. The gentle lady is not addressing the scope of this hearing." Crockett paused, looked at him, did not respond, turned back to the witness. "Inspector General Morrison, in your report dated March 12th, you documented—" Jordan again. "Mr. Chairman, I must insist this is outside the agreed parameters." The chairman, visibly uncomfortable, asked Crockett to proceed. She did. Jordan interrupted a third time within 90 seconds. By the fourth interruption, something in the room had shifted. The press gallery, which had been half attentive, was now fully awake. Cameras that had been positioned for standard C-SPAN coverage were beginning to tighten their framing. Jordan seemed energized by his own disruptions, leaning forward each time, his voice rising slightly in volume with each objection. Crockett's expression had not changed once. By the eighth interruption, Jordan was no longer offering procedural objections. He was editorializing. "The gentle lady clearly hasn't reviewed the full context of the Inspector General's mandate." Crockett set down her pen with the kind of precision surgeons use when placing instruments on a sterile tray. She turned in her chair to face him directly for the first time. Her voice, when it came, was not louder, it was colder. "Congressman Jordan, I have reviewed the full mandate. I have also reviewed the Inspector General's 14 prior reports spanning 6 years, the departmental response memos to each report, and the implementation records showing which recommendations were adopted and which were ignored. I've reviewed the committee's own hearing transcripts from 2019 through 2024 on this exact subject. And I've reviewed your voting record on every appropriations bill that funded or defunded the office we're discussing today." She opened the folder. The room had gone completely quiet. "Would you like to know what I found?" Jordan's face had flushed slightly, the red creeping up from his collar in the way it does when someone who is used to being the loudest voice in the room suddenly isn't. He opened his mouth. Crockett continued as if he hadn't. "Inspector General Morrison's report documents $47 million in unauthorized expenditures between January 2023 and November 2024. Unauthorized meaning spent without congressional approval on programs that were explicitly defunded by this committee. Programs you voted to defund, Congressman Jordan. You were quite vocal about it at the time. You called the spending reckless federal overreach, and those were your exact words in the markup session on February 9th, 2023. It's in the congressional record, page 8431. She turned a page in the folder. The paper made a sound in the silence. "But what the Inspector General's report also shows, and this is on page 63 if you'd like to follow along, is that those same expenditures continued for 11 months after the committee vote. 11 months. Someone authorized that spending. Someone signed those requisitions. Someone approved those contracts." Jordan started to speak. Crockett's hand came up, not aggressively, just a small gesture that somehow carried absolute authority. "I'm not finished." Jordan stopped. "Now, the interesting part," Crockett continued, "is that when Inspector General Morrison attempted to investigate who authorized the continued spending, he was blocked. Not by the department, by members of this committee. His office submitted 17 formal requests for documentation between March 2023 and August 2024. 17. 12 of those requests went unanswered entirely. Of the 5 that received responses, 4 were heavily redacted, and 1 was returned with a cover letter stating that the requested documents were not subject to oversight jurisdiction. That letter was signed by your Chief of Staff, Congressman Jordan. She pulled a document from the folder and placed it face up on the table in front of her, angled so the camera could see the letterhead and signature line. That's his signature, that's your office. Blocking an investigation into spending that you yourself called reckless federal overreach. The room was absolutely still. Jordan's hands had moved to grip the edge of the table in front of him. His prepared talking points, whatever they had been, were clearly no longer operative. He tried deflection. The gentle lady is conflating oversight with... Crockett spoke over him for the first time, her voice not rising in volume, but cutting through his with the precision of someone who had been interrupted 14 times and had counted every one. Congressman Jordan, I'm conflating nothing. I'm reading from documents your office produced. But let's talk about conflation. Let's talk about what you said in your opening statement this morning. She turned back a page in the folder. You stated, and I quote, "This committee has been relentless in pursuing accountability and transparency across every federal agency." Relentless, that was your word, so let's examine that. Inspector General Morrison issued 14 reports in the last 6 years, 14 documented cases of spending irregularities, contract fraud, or administrative misconduct. This committee held hearings on 6 of them, 6 out of 14. You were present for 3 of those 6 hearings. You asked questions in 2. In both cases, the subject of the hearing involved agencies under Democratic administration. The 8 reports that were never investigated, 7 of them involved agencies or programs championed by Republican leadership. The 8th involved a contractor who donated $340,000 to Republican congressional campaigns in the 2022 cycle. That's not in the Inspector General's report. That's in the Federal Election Commission database, public record. Anyone can look it up. Jordan was staring at her now with the kind of focus that comes when someone realizes they are not in the kind of fight they thought they were in. The gentle lady is cherry-picking? Crockett's voice was ice. I am reading from your committee's own hearing schedule, Congressman. I am reading from the FEC database. I am reading from sworn testimony that this committee chose not to follow up on. If you believe any of these facts are inaccurate, I invite you to correct them on the record right now. Which fact would you like to dispute? Silence. 5 seconds. 10. Jordan's mouth opened. No sound came out initially. Finally, he managed... The scope of oversight priorities is determined by the chair in consultation with... Crockett did not let him finish the deflection. The scope of oversight priorities. Let's talk about that. She pulled another document from the folder. This is the committee's oversight plan filed in January 2023 as required by House rules. It lists 12 priority areas for investigation. 12. Number 4 on that list is waste, fraud, and abuse in federal contracting. Direct quote. Inspector General Morrison's report from August 2023, 8 months after this plan was filed, documented $22 million in fraudulent billings by a defense contractor in Kentucky. The contractor billed for work that was never performed using falsified inspection reports and forged supervisory signatures. The Inspector General referred the case to the Justice Department and to this committee for review. This committee took no action. You took no action, Congressman Jordan. The contractor is still operating under active federal contracts as of this morning. I checked at 7:30 a.m. today. $18 million in current contract obligations. Jordan's face had gone from red to something closer to gray. His hands were still gripping the table edge. He was no longer leaning forward. That case was referred to... Crockett kept going. That case was referred to this committee on August 14th, 2023. It is now March 2025. 19 months, no hearing, no subpoena, no follow-up inquiry of any kind. But here's what did get a hearing in that same time period. The committee held 4 hearings on the personal laptop of a private citizen. 4. Combined hearing time, 16 hours. Witnesses called 31, subpoenas issued 14, documents reviewed thousands. And what did those hearings uncover? According to the committee's own summary report, which you filed in December, the findings were inconclusive and no criminal referrals were made. 16 hours for inconclusive findings on a private laptop. 0 hours for $22 million in documented fraud with forged signatures and an active Justice Department case. The gallery had stopped typing. The kind of silence that comes when a room full of people who document things for a living recognize they are watching something they will be referencing for years. Jordan tried again. His voice had lost the performative confidence from the opening. The gentle lady is mischaracterizing the committee's investigative priorities. Crockett's tone did not change. She was not angry. She was not triumphant. She sounded like someone reading an actuarial table. Congressman Jordan, I am not mischaracterizing anything. I am counting. 4 hearings versus 0 hearings, 16 hours versus 0 hours, 31 witnesses versus 0 witnesses. That is not characterization, that is math. She closed the folder but kept her hand on it, as if the weight of it alone carried authority. And since you have interrupted me 14 times this morning, yes, I counted those too, I'd like to ask you a direct question and I'd appreciate an uninterrupted answer. The room leaned in. Jordan said nothing. Crockett's voice was quiet, but every word landed. Do you believe this committee has a responsibility to investigate documented fraud, regardless of which party controls the agency or which political donors are involved? Or do you believe oversight is a tool to be used selectively against political opponents? The question hung in the air like a blade. Jordan stared at her. His jaw worked. His hands were white where they gripped the table. 10 seconds. 15. 20. Someone in the press gallery coughed, and the sound was startling in the total silence. A pen dropped somewhere in the back row. Jordan's mouth opened. He started to speak, stopped, started again. What came out was not an answer. That is an unfair framing of... Crockett's voice was soft and absolutely final. It's a yes or no question, Congressman. 23 seconds. The cameras were all on Jordan now. His face had gone from gray to something blotchy, red patches on pale skin. His breathing was visible. For a man who had built a career on never backing down, never conceding ground, never letting an opponent have the last word, the silence was obliterating. He could not answer yes because the record she had just laid out showed the answer was no. He could not answer no because saying it out loud would end him. So he said nothing. The chairman, sensing catastrophe, tried to interject. The committee will move to the next. Crockett spoke over him, still looking at Jordan. I'll take the silence as your answer, Congressman. She stood, gathered her folder, and walked toward the exit. Not quickly, not in anger, with the kind of measured dignity that suggests the work is done and there is nothing left to say. Jordan remained in his seat, hands still gripping the table, staring at the space where she had been sitting. The press gallery erupted. Reporters were already typing, already pulling clips, already forming the headlines that would dominate the next 72 hours of political media. 3 hours later, video clips of the exchange were trending on every platform. The 14 interruptions condensed into 90 seconds, the 23 seconds of silence isolated and looped. The final question, yes or no, Congressman, shared 40,000 times in the first hour alone. By evening, Jordan's office had released a statement calling Crockett's questions a partisan stunt and accusing her of selectively presenting facts out of context. And the statement did not identify which facts were out of context. It did not dispute the dollar amounts. It did not explain the 11 months of unauthorized spending or the blocked Inspector General requests or the contractor still operating under federal contracts despite documented fraud. The statement was 3 paragraphs of deflection that answered nothing. But the silence had already answered everything. The internet does not forget 23 seconds of a powerful man unable to speak when asked if he believes in equal application of oversight. That silence became the story, not because it was dramatic, but because it was complete. There was no comeback, no talking point, no pivot that could undo it. Crockett had asked the one question that had no good answer, and Jordan, for perhaps the first time in his congressional career, had been unable to fill the space with noise. The hearing continued without him. He left during the next witness's testimony, microphone still clipped to his lapel, walking toward the chamber exit with the stiff posture of someone who knows cameras are following but cannot bring themselves to turn around. The door closed behind him with a soft click that the microphones picked up clearly. Crockett remained for the full hearing, asked 3 more questions of subsequent witnesses, each one calm, each one documented, each one received without a single interruption. When the hearing adjourned at 4:47 p.m., she was the last person to leave the chamber. She stopped at the door, turned back to look at the empty room for just a moment, and then walked out into the hallway where reporters were waiting. They asked her about the confrontation. She did not call it a confrontation. They asked if she had planned to ask that question. She said she had planned to ask whatever question the evidence required. They asked if she thought Jordan would respond. She said the silence was the response. Someone asked if this was about holding power accountable. Crockett stopped walking, turned to face the cameras directly, and spoke with the same measured tone she had used in the hearing room. This isn't about partisan politics. This is about whether oversight means anything. Inspector General Morrison did his job. He documented fraud, waste, and abuse, and he referred it to the people whose job is to investigate. If we only investigate when it's politically convenient, then we're not conducting oversight. We're conducting theater, and the American people deserve better than theater. She walked away before they could ask follow-ups. The clip ran on evening news across every network, not because it was inflammatory, but because it was true in a way that political commentary rarely is. 14 interruptions, 23 seconds of silence, one question with no good answer, and a woman who had been underestimated from the moment she walked into the room, holding a single folder that contained every receipt required to dismantle a career built on never admitting fault. By morning, Jim Jordan had still not answered the question. The silence, it turned out, was permanent, and Jasmine Crockett, who had been interrupted 14 times before 10 a.m., on a Thursday morning had proven that sometimes the most devastating response is not the one you give, but the one you make impossible to avoid. She had not raised her voice. She had not matched his energy. She had simply come prepared, stayed calm, and asked the question that mattered. In a city built on people who talk their way out of accountability, she had found the one man who could not, and she had given him exactly enough silence to prove it.